The morning of February 19th, 1945, 6 miles above the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, where the air is so thin that each breath through an oxygen mask feels like drowning in reverse. Warrant Officer Matsuo Hagiri banks his Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, the aircraft Americans will codename Frank, into a climbing turn. His engine screams in protest. The manifold pressure gauge trembles near the red line. At 11,800 meters, he is approaching the absolute ceiling of what his fighter can achieve. The controls feel mushy, delayed, as if he is flying through honey rather than air. Above him, 4 silhouettes continue ascending. They are Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Even from this distance, they look wrong, too fat, too heavy, shaped like beer barrels strapped to wings. Each aircraft weighs nearly 4,000 kilograms fully loaded. By every principle Hagiri learned in flight school, they should be wallowing up here, struggling for every meter of altitude. Instead, they climb effortlessly into airspace that should not exist for fighters this heavy. Hagiri pulls harder on the stick. His vision tunnels at the edges, the first warning sign of hypoxia. The altimeter needle crawls past 12,000 meters, 39,000 feet. His Ki-84 shudders. The engine coughs once, twice. The propeller windmills uselessly in air too thin to bite. The Americans keep climbing. At 12,500 meters, 41,000 feet, Hagiri's fighter stalls. The nose drops. For 3 seconds, he hangs suspended in the sky, watching the 4 Thunderbolts roll inverted directly above him. Then they dive. They fall toward him at over 800 kilometers per hour, faster than his fighter can manage in level flight with the throttle firewall, faster than physics should allow for aircraft that are heavy. Hagiri pushes his stick forward, diving away, trading precious altitude for speed. Behind him, tracers arc through the space his fighter occupied 2 heartbeats earlier. 850 caliber machine guns, 4 tons of aircraft carrying 400 kilograms of ammunition, flash past him in a vertical dive so steep it seems suicidal. Then, impossibly, the Thunderbolts are climbing again, back toward that untouchable altitude where Japanese fighters cannot follow. This is not how air combat is supposed to work. This is the story of how American engineers accidentally rewrote the physics of aerial warfare and how Japanese pilots discovered that the sky itself had become enemy territory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened at 40,000 feet above Iwo Jima, we must first understand what air combat meant in 1944 and why the P-47 Thunderbolt should never have been able to do what it did. The Pacific War, in its 3rd year, had settled into a grim calculus of attrition. American industrial capacity was producing aircraft at rates that seemed hallucinatory to Japanese commanders. In 1944 alone, American factories delivered over 96,000 aircraft of all types. Japan, by comparison, produced 28,000. But numbers alone do not win dogfights. Performance does. And in the swirling, close-range combat that characterized Pacific air battles, Japanese fighters held crucial advantages. The Mitsubishi A6M0 by 1944, obsolescent but still numerous, could outturn virtually any American fighter at low to medium altitude. Its roll rate was exceptional. Its operational range was extraordinary. A Zero could fly over 3,000 kilometers with external tanks, enabling deep strikes that American fighters could not match without forward bases. But the Zero's advantages came with severe limitations. Its engine, the Nakajima Sakai, produced only 1,100 horsepower at takeoff. Its service sealing the altitude at which it could maintain level flight was approximately 10,000 meters, 33,000 feet. Above that altitude, the Zero became a gutless, sluggish machine, controlled, frozen, engine starving for oxygen. Japanese aviation doctrine in 1944 was built around aircraft optimized for low to medium altitude combat. Maneuverability over speed, agility over firepower. This was not stupidity. It was a coherent philosophy born from early war experience, when Zeros dominated Allied fighters in turning engagements. Even Japan's newest fighters reflected this doctrine. The Nakajima Ki 84 Frank, introduced in mid-1944 and considered by many historians to be Japan's best all-around fighter of the war, represented a significant advancement. It could reach 640 km per hour in level flight. Its service ceiling was 11,500 meters, 37,700 feet. It carried heavy armament, two 20mm cannon and two 12.7mm machine guns. By Japanese standards, Frank was a revelation. By American standards, it was almost adequate. Because while Japanese engineers were incrementally improving performance within established parameters, American engineers were pursuing something more radical. Brute force engineering that violated conventional wisdom about what was possible. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt emerged from a design philosophy that would have seemed absurd to Japanese engineers. Build the fighter around the engine, not the other way around. At the heart of every Thunderbolt was the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine that displaced 2,800 cubic inches per revolution, hence the designation R-2800. At takeoff power, early versions produced 2,000 horsepower. Later variants with water injection could briefly generate 2,800 horsepower. To put this in perspective, the Zero's engine produced 1,100 horsepower. The Frank's Nakajima Homare engine produced around 1,900 horsepower. The Thunderbolt's engine produced more power than both combined. But raw horsepower meant nothing at altitude without a way to force enough oxygen into the cylinders. At sea level, air pressure is approximately 100 kilopascals, 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 10,000 meters, 33,000 feet, air pressure drops to 26 kilopascals, less than 1/4 sea level pressure. Piston engines are air pumps. Reduce the air pressure, and you reduce the power. A naturally aspirated engine at 30,000 feet produces roughly 1/4 its sea level horsepower. Climb to 40,000 feet, and you have barely enough power to maintain level flight, let alone fight. The solution was forced induction, mechanically compressing incoming air before it entered the cylinders. Superchargers used engine power to drive a compressor. Turbochargers used exhaust gases to spin a turbine that drove the compressor. Both systems forced more air into the engine than atmospheric pressure alone would provide. The P-47 used both. The General Electric Type B turbo-supercharger sat in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by an elaborate system of ducting that routed exhaust gases back from the engine, through the turbine, and out the bottom of the aircraft. The turbine spun at speeds exceeding 20,000 revolutions per minute, compressing intake air to sea level pressure or higher regardless of altitude. In addition, the R-2800 incorporated a two-stage mechanical supercharger driven directly by the engine. The first stage compressed intake air. The intercooler cooled it. The second stage compressed it again. The turbocharger compressed it a third time. The result was an engine that, at 40,000 feet, could produce more power than most fighters, generated at sea level. But there was a problem. Actually, there are several problems. First, compression generates heat. Compress air too much, and the fuel-air mixture detonates prematurely pre-ignition that destroys pistons and cylinder heads within seconds. The intercooler helped, but there were limits. Second, the turbo-supercharger system added over 300 kilograms to the aircraft's weight. The ducting, the turbine, the wastegate controls, the oil system, all of it added complexity and weight to an already heavy airframe. Third, and most critically for pilots, the early P-47 models were dangerously slow to accelerate in the climb. Getting a 3,500 kilogram fighter to 30,000 feet took time during which the aircraft was vulnerable, time that consumed fuel, time that telegraphed your intentions to every enemy pilot within visual range. By late 1943, P-47 units in both Europe and the Pacific had developed tactics to exploit the aircraft's strengths, dive on the enemy from altitude, make one high-speed pass, then zoom climb away before the enemy could react. Energy tactics, boom and zoom, But Japanese pilots were adapting. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai was, by 1944, one of Japan's most experienced surviving fighter pilots. He had flown combat missions since the opening days of the war, over China, over the Philippines, over Guadalcanal, where American bullets destroyed his right eye and left him partially paralyzed for months. By mid-1944, Sakai was flying from Clark Field in the Philippines, leading young pilots with a fraction of his experience against American raids that grew larger and more frequent with each passing month. In his post-war memoir, Sakai described encountering P-47 seconds over Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. We expected the American fighters to engage us at our altitude, perhaps 7,000 meters. This was standard in our experience. The Sir. Americans would dive from above, we would scatter, then regroup and turn to meet them. In the turning fight that followed, our superior maneuverability gave us the advantage. But these P-47 seconds did not descend to our altitude. They remained far above us, so high we could barely make out their shapes against the sky, perhaps 9 or 10,000 meters. When they attacked, they came vertically, from directly above. The speed was tremendous. We barely had time to break formation before they were through us. We turned to engage, but they did not stay to fight. They climbed away, back to that impossible altitude, faster than we could follow. Within 2 minutes, they were small specks again, untouchable. What Sakai described was not luck. It was deliberate tactical doctrine born from engineering capability. But what Sakai did not know, what no Japanese pilot initially understood, was that the P-47 seconds he encountered over the Philippines in October of 1944 were not yet operating at their full potential. Because in the final months of 1944, Republic Aviation and Pratt and Whitney engineers had made the Thunderbolt even more impossible. The P-47D-25, entering service in late 1944, incorporated a modification that seemed like madness. A water-methanol injection system that sprayed a 50-50 mixture of water and methanol directly into the engine during combat. The system was elegantly simple in concept, brutally complex in execution. A 63-litre tank installed behind the cockpit held the water-methanol mixture. An electrically driven pump, controlled by a switch on the throttle quadrant, injected the fluid into the supercharger inlet at a rate of approximately 6 litres per minute. When the water-methanol mixture vaporized in the intake charge, it absorbed enormous amounts of heat, cooling the compressed air by nearly 60 degrees Celsius. Cooler air is denser. Denser air means more oxygen per cylinder per combustion cycle. More oxygen means more fuel can be burned. More fuel burned means more power. The system allowed the R-2800 engine to operate at manifold pressures that would normally cause catastrophic detonation. Instead of 52 inches of mercury at altitude, pilots could push to 72 inches. For 5 to 15 minutes, until the water-methanol tank ran dry, the engine could produce 2,800 horsepower at altitudes above 12,000 meters. 2,800 horsepower at 40,000 feet. For comparison, the Zero's engine produced 700 horsepower at that altitude. Frank's engine might manage 1,000 horsepower if everything was working perfectly. The Thunderbolt, with water injection, produced nearly 3 times the power of its opponents, while operating in airspace those opponents could barely reach. But the system came with costs. Water-methanol injection reduced engine life by approximately 50%. The tremendous internal stresses compression ratios far beyond normal operating parameters, wore piston rings, burned valves, stressed connecting rods. An R-2800 engine running water injection regularly might last 400 hours before requiring major overhaul. Without water injection, the same engine could run 800 hours or more. Pilots were instructed to use water injection only in combat, only when absolutely necessary. 5 minutes of emergency power, 10 minutes maximum. More than that, and you risked cooking the engine in flight. But 5 minutes at altitude was enough to change everything. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, 56th Fighter Group, was selected to conduct the first operational test of the water injection system in January of 1945. Johnson was already an ace, credited with destroying 27 German aircraft. He understood energy tactics intimately, the mathematics of altitude and speed, the calculus of potential and kinetic energy that governed modern air combat. The test profile was straightforward. Climb to maximum altitude with water injection, evaluate aircraft handling, report results. Johnson departed Boxted Airfield in England on a crystalline morning. Temperature at altitude was predicted to be -55 degrees Celsius. At 10,000 feet, his breath fogged the inside of the canopy despite the heating system. At 20,000 feet, the temperature gauge read -40. At 30,000 feet, -50. At 35,000 feet, Johnson engaged the water injection system. The effect was immediate and startling. The manifold pressure gauge, which had been reading 52 inches, jumped to 70 inches. The engine note deepened and became rougher. The entire airframe vibrated differently, a deeper, more aggressive resonance. The rate of climb, which had diminished to barely 200 feet per minute at 35,000 feet, suddenly doubled. 400 feet per minute. At 35,000 feet. Johnson continued climbing. At 40,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was still accelerating. The controls remained responsive, mushy compared to sea level, but far more solid than they should be at this altitude. At 42,000 feet, Johnson leveled off. The air was so thin that his oxygen regulator hissed continuously, forcing pure oxygen into his lungs with each breath. The sky above had transitioned from blue to deep purple. Below, he could see the English Channel, and, beyond it, the coast of France, over 160 kilometers distant. He pushed the throttle forward and nosed into a shallow dive. The airspeed indicator wound up. 450 kilometers per hour. 500, 550. At this altitude, with this power, the Thunderbolt was faster than anything else in the sky. Johnson later wrote in his combat diary, "The aircraft felt different with water injection. More powerful, certainly, but also more violent. The engine vibrated at frequencies I had not felt before. It sounded angry. When I pushed the throttle forward in the dive, the acceleration was unlike anything I had experienced in 3 years of combat flying. It felt less like an aircraft and more like a ballistic object, something that had been fired rather than flown." Johnson's test flight validated what engineers had theoretically predicted. The water-methanol injection system extended the P-47's performance envelope into airspace where no opposing fighter could follow. But validation in a test flight is different from application in combat. The question remained, could pilots use this capability effectively against an enemy who did not yet understand what they were facing? The answer came 5 weeks later, in the skies above Iwo Jima. The invasion of Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945. 8 square kilometers of volcanic rock and ash, located 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo. Too small to be strategically significant on its own. Invaluable as an emergency landing site for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan, the Japanese garrison numbered over 20,000 troops entrenched in an elaborate network of tunnels and bunkers. The invasion would cost nearly 7,000 American lives and over 20,000 Japanese lives. It would last 36 days. But on the morning of February 19th, as Marines waded ashore under withering fire, the air battle above Iwo Jima was about to demonstrate a different kind of asymmetry. The 318th Fighter Group had transitioned to P-47 Newtons, Thunderbolts, in January of 1945. The N model was the ultimate development of the Thunderbolt design: larger fuel tanks for extended range, strengthened wings, a bubble canopy for improved visibility, and most critically, the R-2800 engine with water-methanol injection as standard equipment. Lieutenant James Tapp, leading a 4-ship flight, that morning had approximately 80 hours in the P-47 Newtons, not extensive, but sufficient to understand the aircraft's capabilities. He had flown P-38 Lightnings earlier in the war. He understood the weakness of fighting at medium altitude in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese fighters could dictate terms through superior maneuverability. The briefing that morning had been specific. Maintain top cover at maximum altitude over the invasion fleet. Intercept any Japanese fighters attempting to reach the amphibious forces below. Do not, and this was emphasized, descend to low altitude to chase stragglers. The real threat was an organized attack from medium altitude. Deny the enemy access to that altitude band, and you deny them the ability to mass for effective strikes. TAP's flight departed Saipan at 06:15 and climbed toward Iwo Jima. By 07:30, they were on station at 12,500 meters, 41,000 feet. At this altitude, the world looks different. The curvature of the Earth becomes visible at the horizons. The sky above transitions from blue to violet to nearly black. Below, the ocean is a featureless grey expanse, the individual waves invisible, only the texture of light on water suggesting movement. The Thunderbolts circled in a loose combat spread. TAP could see the invasion fleet, dozens of ships arrayed offshore, grey shapes surrounded by white wakes. Closer to the island, landing craft moved in geometric patterns toward the beaches. At 07:42, TAP spotted aircraft climbing from the north. 6 contacts, still distant, but their contrails were vivid white streaks against the darker sky. Japanese fighters, climbing to intercept. He identified them as Ki 84 Franks, Japan's best high-altitude fighter. If anything could challenge the Thunderbolts at this altitude, it would be Frank. Its service ceiling was officially listed as 11,500 meters, but combat reports suggested experienced pilots could coax them to 12,000 meters in favorable conditions. TAP watched the Japanese formation climb. 8,000 meters, 9,000, 10,000. At 11,000 meters, the Japanese fighters began to labor. Their rate of climb decreased visibly. The contrails became intermittent, a sign that the engines were struggling, running rough in the thin air. At 11,500 meters, 37,700 feet, the Japanese formation leveled off. They had reached their ceiling. TAP's flight was 3,500 feet above them. 1,000 meters of vertical separation. In energy terms, an enormous advantage. But TAP did not descend to engage. Instead, he did something the Japanese pilots below did not expect. He climbed. He engaged the water injection system. The manifold pressure jumped from 52 inches to 70. The engine note roughened. His rate of climb, which had been minimal at this altitude, doubled. 12,800 meters, 42,000 feet. His Thunderbolt was still climbing. Below, the Japanese pilots watched. What were they thinking? TAP would never know. But he could imagine their confusion. Every principle of aviation suggested that the heavier aircraft, the one already at extreme altitude, should be unable to climb further. Yet the Thunderbolts were ascending into airspace that should not exist. At 13,000 meters, 42,650 feet, TAP rolled inverted and pushed forward on the stick. The Thunderbolt dropped into a vertical dive. The physics of a dive from this altitude are extraordinary. The aircraft is already traveling at over 400 kilometers per hour in level flight. Add gravity, and the acceleration is rapid. The airspeed indicator wound up. 500 kilometers per hour, 550, 600. The wind noise became a scream. The control forces stiffened air loading on the control surfaces increased exponentially with speed. TAP had to brace both hands on the stick to maintain control. At 750 kilometers per hour, 465 miles per hour, he was approaching the aircraft's maximum structural velocity. Any faster, and the wings might fold. He flashed through the Japanese formation in less than 3 seconds. His wingman, Lieutenant Robert Chen, fired a burst 850 caliber guns, 4,000 rounds per minute combined rate of fire that struck one Frank in the engine cowling. TAP saw the impact bright flashes along Frank's nose, pieces of cowling tearing away in the slipstream. Black smoke poured from the engine. The Japanese fighter nosed down, losing altitude, trailing smoke. Then TAP was through the formation and below it. His airspeed was too high to maneuver. Any turn at this speed would black him out from G-forces or tear the wings off. So he did the only thing possible. He continued the dive until his speed decreased enough to safely pull out, then transitioned into a zoom climb trading speed for altitude, using his kinetic energy to regain his potential energy advantage. By the time the Japanese pilots oriented themselves, by the time they understood what had happened and turned to pursue TAPS, flight was already 5 kilometers away, climbing back toward 12,000 meters. The entire engagement had lasted 23 seconds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mission report, filed by Lieutenant Tapp that afternoon, is preserved in the National Archives. It is written in the clipped, technical language characteristic of combat reports: altitudes, speeds, times, results. 1 enemy aircraft was damaged, no friendly losses. Ammunition expended, approximately 400 rounds per aircraft. But buried in the narrative section is a single observation that captures something more profound. Japanese fighters appeared unable or unwilling to engage above 37,000 feet. They maintained formation but made no attempt to climb toward our altitude. After our attack passed, they dispersed and descended. No pursuit was observed. Unable or unwilling. Tapp could not determine which, and the distinction matters. Were the Japanese pilots physically unable to climb higher, engines starved for oxygen, controls frozen, aircraft on the edge of stalling? Or were they unwilling, having learned through bitter experience that climbing toward the Thunderbolts meant entering an altitude band where American fighters had such overwhelming energy advantage that resistance was suicide? Probably both. To understand what the Japanese pilots experienced that morning, we must understand the concept of energy maneuverability, the mathematical relationship between altitude, speed, and combat effectiveness. Every aircraft has an energy state defined by its altitude and velocity. Altitude represents potential energy, energy you can trade for speed by diving. Velocity represents kinetic energy, energy you can trade for altitude by climbing. In combat, victory goes to the pilot, who can operate at a higher energy state than his opponent. Higher energy means more options. You can dive faster, you can climb higher, you can dictate the terms of engagement. The equation for specific energy is straightforward. ES equals H plus V squared divided by 2 grams, where ES is specific energy, H is altitude, V is velocity, and G is gravitational acceleration. A P-47 newtons, at 12,500 meters, traveling at 450 kilometers per hour, has a specific energy of approximately 14,500 joules per kilogram. A Kai 84 Frank, at 11,500 meters, traveling at 400 kilometers per hour, has a specific energy of approximately 12,800 joules per kilogram. Difference: 1,700 joules per kilogram. That difference, 12%, represents an advantage so overwhelming that the lower energy aircraft cannot overcome it without the higher energy aircraft making a critical mistake. But the real asymmetry was not the 12% energy difference. The real asymmetry was what happened when both aircraft attempted to change their energy state. When Tapp dove from 13,000 meters, his Thunderbolt could reach 750 kilometers per hour, converting altitude into speed at a rate the Frank could not match. When Tapp then zoomed back to altitude, his water-injected engine could sustain a climb rate of over 300 meters per minute at 11,000 meters, triple what the Frank could achieve. The Japanese pilots were not fighting an aircraft, they were fighting a physics advantage they had no ability to counter. Matsuo Hagiri, the pilot who had tried to intercept Tapp's flight that morning, survived the war. In a 1987 interview with the Japanese Aviation Historical Society, he described his experience. "We knew the P-47 was fast. We knew it was heavy. We knew it could dive very quickly. But we believed we were taught that altitude was finite, that there was a ceiling above which no fighter could operate effectively, regardless of engine power. When I saw the 4 Thunderbolts climb away from us that morning, still accelerating at an altitude where our engines were dying, I understood we were fighting something new, not a better aircraft, a different category of aircraft. It was like being told your entire life that the sky ends at a certain height, and then watching someone walk above that height as if it did not exist. Hagiri's description captures the psychological impact more accurately than statistics. The Thunderbolt did not just outperform Japanese fighters at high altitude, it invalidated the assumptions upon which Japanese fighter doctrine was built. Japanese aviation training in 19%, 44 emphasized maneuverability, deflection, shooting, close-range combat. Pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's tight turning radius and rapid roll rate. They practiced the overhead yo-yo, the lag pursuit, the high-side gun pass tactics designed for knife-fight ranges where agility mattered more than raw speed. But all of those tactics assumed the enemy would fight at the same altitude, in the same energy envelope. The P-47 with water injection did not fight in the same envelope. It fought from a sanctuary of altitude and speed that Japanese fighters physically could not reach. By March of 1945, the tactical impact was unmistakable. Japanese fighter interceptions of B-29 raids decreased markedly, not because Japan lacked fighters or pilots, but because climbing to intercept meant entering altitude bands where P-47 seconds prowled with impunity. A captured Japanese intelligence document from April 1945, translated by Allied intelligence, contained the following assessment. American P-47 fighters equipped with new high-altitude engines now maintain patrols above 13,000 meters during bomber escort missions. Our fighters attempting to intercept at these altitudes are at severe disadvantage in both speed and climb performance. Interception attempts above 12,000 meters frequently result in heavy losses with minimal success. Recommend reorienting fighter tactics toward low-altitude interception of isolated bombers and ground attack aircraft. High-altitude interception against escorted formations is no longer viable with current equipment. That document represents an extraordinary admission. In 2 years, American aviation technology had advanced to a point where Japanese commanders were explicitly instructing their pilots to avoid high-altitude combat entirely. The sky itself had become stratified altitude bands controlled by different forces based purely on engineering capability. Below 8,000 meters, contested airspace where Japanese fighters could still compete. 8,000 to 11,000 meters, marginally contested. Japanese fighters could operate, but at an increasing disadvantage. Above 11,000 meters, American airspace. Entering this altitude band without overwhelming numerical superiority was functionally suicidal, but there was a cost to this dominance that combat reports rarely captured. Captain Quince Brown flew P-47Ns with the 49th Fighter Squadron from March through August of 1945. He logged 47 high-altitude intercept missions operations, where the flight maintained patrol altitude, above 12,000 meters for extended periods. In October 1945, after the war ended, Brown underwent psychological evaluation as part of the Army Air Force's post-combat assessment program. The evaluation report noted, subject reports persistent feelings of isolation and hypervigilance during high-altitude patrols. Describes the experience as being alone in a place where humans should not exist. Subject reports heightened startle response, difficulty sleeping, recurring dreams of cockpit depressurization. Assessment. Subject displays symptoms consistent with sustained high-stress operations in extreme environments. Recommend standard demobilization monitoring. Brown's experience was not unique. Flying at 40,000 feet was not simply high-altitude flight, it was operating at the edge of what the human body could tolerate with period technology. At 42,000 feet, cabin pressure in a P-47 newtons was equivalent to approximately 25,000 feet, enough to require continuous oxygen supplementation. If the oxygen system failed, a pilot had approximately 30 seconds of useful consciousness before hypoxia caused incapacitation. The temperature at 42,000 feet averaged minus 55 degrees Celsius. The cockpit heating system could maintain interior temperature around 10 degrees Celsius if working perfectly. If the heater failed, frostbite was a certainty within minutes. The air at 42,000 feet is less than 1/5 sea level density. If the canopy seal failed, if the pressurization system malfunctioned, the pilot experienced rapid decompression. Eardrums ruptured. Sinuses hemorrhaged. Nitrogen dissolved in the blood formed bubbles, decompression, sickness, potentially fatal. In this environment, pilots flew for hours at a time, maintaining constant vigilance, knowing that any system failure could kill them before they could descend to survivable altitude. They were untouchable. But untouchable meant alone in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Lieutenant William Dunham, who flew 31 high-altitude missions with the 73rd Fighter Squadron, wrote in his personal diary, "At 42,000 feet, the radio is full of static from the ionosphere. Your wingman is a half-mile away close for tactical formation, but visually just a speck against the sky. Below you, the world is abstract clouds and ocean, no detail, no humanity. You are colder than you have ever been. Your oxygen mask is the only thing keeping you conscious. Your engine is running at power settings that might destroy it at any moment. And you are expected to fight from this altitude to dive 6 miles. Engage the enemy at speeds that will rip your wings off if you maneuver too hard, then climb back to this frozen hell. We call it air superiority. It feels more like exile." The R-2800 engine with water injection did not just extend the P-47's performance envelope. It created a new category of air combat high-altitude interception that operated beyond the physical limits of opposing aircraft. But this capability came at a mechanical cost that pilots experienced directly. Water-methanol injection was brutal on engines. The tremendous internal pressures, compression ratios far beyond normal operating. Parameters accelerated wear on every moving part. Piston rings wore faster. Valve seats eroded. Connecting rod bearings sustained higher loads. Cylinder heads cracked. Republic Aviation's post-war technical analysis documented the effect. R-2800 engines operating with water-methanol injection at combat power settings showed mean time between major overhaul of approximately 412 hours, compared to 837 hours for identical engines operating without water injection. Failure modes included piston crown erosion, valve seat recession, connecting rod bearing failure, and cylinder head cracking. Recommendation: water-methanol injection should be considered an emergency power system with limited operational lifespan, not a standard operating mode. For pilots, this meant flying aircraft with engines operating at the edge of catastrophic failure. Every time they engaged in water injection, they were gambling that the engine would survive 5 more minutes of abuse. Most times, it did. Sometimes, it did not. On March 27, 1945, Lieutenant Charles Morrison of the 318th Fighter Group was leading a 4-ship patrol at 12,800 meters above Okinawa. At 0943, he engaged water injection to intercept a formation of Japanese fighters climbing from the west. His engine had accumulated 387 hours of flight time, with approximately 42 minutes of water injection use over 17 previous combat missions. At 0944, his number 3 cylinder head cracked, superheated coolant sprayed into the engine compartment. The engine seized 18 cylinders, stopping simultaneously, the propeller windmilling uselessly. Morrison descended in a glide, trading altitude for distance, trying to reach the fleet offshore. At 8,000 meters, his cockpit filled with smoke as coolant-soaked wiring insulation began smoldering. At 6,000 meters, he bailed out. He was recovered 43 minutes later by a destroyer picket ship, uninjured except for minor frostbite on his hands. His aircraft bureau number 44 to 90347, a P-47 Newtons with 62 combat missions logged, impacted the ocean 19 kilometers east of Okinawa. Total loss. The accident investigation report concluded: engine failure, consistent with prolonged high-power operation beyond normal operational limits. The water-methanol injection system functioned as designed but subjected engine components to thermal and mechanical stress exceeding design margins. No pilot error, no maintenance deficiency. Recommend continued use of water injection in combat with clear understanding of increased engine failure risk. In other words, the system works as intended, but using it will eventually destroy your engine. Use it anyway, because the tactical advantage outweighs the risk. By May of 1945, the air war over Japan had fundamentally changed character. Japanese fighter interceptions became increasingly rare above 10,000 meters. Not because Japan lacked fighters, production continued until August, but because Japanese commanders recognized that high-altitude interception was no longer tactically viable. Instead, Japanese fighters concentrated on low-altitude attacks against ground targets, shipping, and isolated aircraft. Operations where the P-47's altitude advantage was irrelevant, and where terrain masking and surprise could offset American numerical and technological superiority. A Japanese training directive from June 1945, captured after the war, explicitly instructed, "Do not attempt interception of enemy bomber formations above 11,000 meters when escorted by P-47 fighters." High-altitude interception results in prohibitive losses with minimal success rate. Priority targets are unescorted reconnaissance aircraft, ground attack aircraft operating at low altitude, and isolated bombers, separated from formation. When engagement with high-altitude escort fighters is unavoidable, do not attempt to climb toward them. Force them to descend to your altitude through aggressive maneuvering and defensive tactics. Do not pursue diving attacks. They will regain altitude before you can effectively engage. That directive represents the final adaptation of Japanese fighter doctrine to American technological advantage. Having failed to match American high-altitude performance, Japanese tactics evolved to simply avoid fighting in the altitude bands where Americans held decisive advantage. The sky above 11,000 meters became, effectively, American-controlled airspace, not through victory in combat, but through creation of an altitude sanctuary that opponents could not physically access. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai survived the war. In the decades that followed, he became one of Japan's most prominent voices on aerial combat history. He wrote extensively, gave interviews, corresponded with former opponents. In a 1976 interview with Martin Caidin, author of several influential aviation histories, Sakai reflected on the technological asymmetry of the war's final year. "I think American pilots often did not understand what advantage they possessed. They had been trained to fear the Zero, to respect Japanese pilots. This was correct in 1941, in 1942. But by 1945, the situation had reversed so completely that many American pilots still flew as if they were the underdogs. The truth is that by early 1945, a properly trained American pilot in a P-47 with water injection was effectively invincible against any Japanese fighter if he followed correct tactics. Not because of superior skill was largely irrelevant. Because of engineering. We could not reach them. That is the simple truth. They flew in altitudes we could not access, attacked at speeds we could not match, and climbed away before we could respond. The individual quality of the pilot became secondary to the performance of the aircraft. I do not believe Americans understood how profound this advantage was. To them, it was simply good tactics and good equipment. To us, it felt like the laws of nature had been changed without warning. Sakai's observation cuts to the heart of what the R-2800 engine with water injection represented. Not incremental improvement, but categorical superiority that invalidated conventional tactical assumptions. After the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt was rapidly phased out of service. The Army Air Forces, soon to become the independent United States Air Force, transitioned to jet fighters with extraordinary speed. By 1948, most P-47 seconds had been relegated to Air National Guard units or sold to Allied nations. The aircraft was too heavy, too complex, too maintenance-intensive for peacetime operations. The R-2800 engine required constant attention. The turbo-supercharger system was temperamental. Spare parts were expensive. By 1955, almost no P-47 seconds remained in American military service. The aircraft that had dominated the skies above the Pacific in 1945 was obsolete a decade later, superseded by jets that could fly higher, faster, farther, without the mechanical complexity of piston engines and superchargers. But the legacy of what the P-47 represented, the application of overwhelming engineering capability to create categorical tactical advantage, continued. The F-86 Sabre in Korea, the F-4 Phantom in Vietnam, the F-15 Eagle in the Middle East. Each generation of American fighter aircraft pursued the same goal: create such an overwhelming performance advantage that opponents cannot compete on equal terms. Sometimes this works. Sometimes it does not. But the underlying philosophy that engineering advantage can substitute for tactical parity traces directly to lessons learned in the skies above Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. In 1993, a restored P-47D Thunderbolt tail number 42-26847, one of fewer than 10 airworthy examples remaining worldwide, was flown to Japan for an airshow commemorating the 50th anniversary of the war's end. Among the attendees was Matsuo Hagiri, the pilot who had tried to intercept American fighters above Iwo Jima in February 1945. He was given the opportunity to sit in the cockpit of the restored P-47. News photographs from the event show an elderly man, 81 years old, bald, wearing a dark suit, sitting in the pilot's seat, his hands on the control stick. He was asked what he remembered most clearly about encountering P-47 seconds during the war. His answer: the sound. When they dove from altitude with the throttle wide open, the engine made a sound I had never heard before. It was not the high-pitched scream of our engines at maximum power. It was deeper. More like thunder, like something fundamental in the world had changed. Thunder. The name was accidentally perfect. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt never achieved the iconic status of the P-51 Mustang or the Supermarine Spitfire. It was too utilitarian, too workmanlike, too much like a flying tractor. But in terms of sheer engineering accomplishment, in terms of taking an impossibly heavy airframe and giving it performance that violated common sense, the Thunderbolt represents something more significant than elegance. It represents the moment when American industrial philosophy build it big, build it strong, solve problems with horsepower and engineering, rather than finesse, achieved its purest expression in aerial combat. The R-2800 engine with water injection did not produce the most power per unit weight. It was not the most efficient. It was not the most elegant solution. But it produced enough power to make a 4-ton fighter climb to 42,000 feet and still fight effectively. And in the context of 1945, that was enough. Japanese aviation technology in 1945 was not primitive. The Ki-84 Frank was an excellent fighter by any standard. The Ki-100 and N-1 KJ George, introduced in the final months of the war, were arguably the best all-around fighters Japan produced. But they were optimized for a different kind of war, one where combat occurred at medium altitude and maneuverability mattered more than brute force. The P-47 rendered that optimization irrelevant by simply refusing to fight on those terms. This is the deeper lesson. Technological advantage is not always about building something better. Sometimes it is about building something so different that existing tactics cannot counter it. There is a P-47D-30 on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Tail number 44-20371. It wears the markings of the 56th Fighter Group, the unit that produced more aces than any other American fighter group in Europe. The placards beside the aircraft describe its specifications. Maximum speed, 430 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 43,000 feet. Range, 1,900 miles with external tanks. Armament, 8 50 caliber machine guns with over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Nowhere on the placards does it mention water-methanol injection. Nowhere does it describe the turbo-supercharger system that made high-altitude performance possible. Nowhere does it explain that this aircraft represented a fundamental rethinking of what fighters could do. To a casual observer, it looks like a large, somewhat ungainly fighter. The fuselage is massive. The wings are thick. The landing gear is tall and sturdy, designed to handle rough field operations. It does not look like the aircraft that rendered Japanese fighters irrelevant at high altitude. It does not look like the machine that rewrote the rules of air combat. But in 1945, at 42,000 feet above the Pacific, it was the most dangerous fighter in the world. In his 1987 interview, Matsuo Hagiri was asked one final question. If you had known in 1945 what the P-47 was capable of, if you had understood the full extent of their altitude advantage, would you have flown any differently? His answer: what difference would it have made? Knowledge does not change physics. We could not build engines that produced 3,000 horsepower. We did not have turbochargers that maintained sea-level pressure at 13,000 meters. We did not have the industrial capacity to manufacture water-methanol injection systems for thousands of fighters. Understanding your opponent's advantage does not give you the ability to counter it. It only clarifies the extent of your disadvantage. I think about that morning above Iwo Jima often. Watching the P-47 seconds climb away from us, ascending into altitude we could not reach. It was not anger, I felt, or fear. It was something closer to understanding. We were not defeated by better pilots or better tactics. We were defeated by engineering, by industrial capacity, that allowed America to build fighters that operated in airspace we could not access. The battle was lost in factories in Connecticut and Indiana, not in the skies over the Pacific. That is a difficult truth to accept, but it is true nonetheless. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.